80 to 150 feet. That's how tall a coal breaker could rise straight up out of a Pennsylvania hillside. 8 to 15 stories of timber and blackened steel, windows running floor to floor like the nave of a cathedral, except this one was built by men who worshipped tonnage instead of God. Coal went in at the top, raw and full of rock. It came out at the bottom, clean, sized, and ready to burn. And somewhere on the long fall in between, boys as young as 8 sat directly in the machine's path, with their bare hands out, picking slate from a stream of moving coal, while the whole building shook around them like something alive. It took fingers, it took feet, sometimes it took a whole boy, and gave nothing back but a body pulled out of the gears once the shift finally ended, because the machine itself never once stopped long enough to let anyone out sooner. What kind of building runs through a child screaming and doesn't slow down? And what did it do, slowly, to the ones who actually managed to survive it? Because survival here came with its own bill. Black dust, breathed in hour after hour, settling into lungs that hadn't finished growing and never fully leaving again. For more than 100 years, when men and boys stumbled out of these buildings coughing up something dark, the physicians on the company payroll had an answer ready. Nothing to worry about. That answer held for generations longer than it had any right to. Buildings exactly like this one stood over towns across northeastern Pennsylvania for the better part of a century and a half. And then, on an April afternoon in 2014, the last true giant of them still standing came down. Not by accident, not by fire, the way so many of its predecessors had gone. By plan, by excavator and wrecking claw, on purpose, in front of the grandchildren of the men it had crippled. So here's the question this video is actually going to answer, and it isn't the one you'd expect. It isn't whether that building deserved to fall. It obviously did. The real question is this: why did it take 137 years? What, exactly, was that machine still hiding on the day the wrecking crews finally showed up? And what does it say about a country that it took that long to let one building stop hurting people? The lungs, the gears, the 11 stories of denial standing over one small town, and the afternoon the valley went black one last time, the day the breaker itself, finally, deliberately, came down. The machine that ate boys for breakfast. It killed, it maimed, and it did both to children, for pay measured in pennies, for the better part of a century, and nobody in charge considered that a reason to slow down. Start with the number that should stop you cold. At its historic high point, in 1907, 24,000 boys were on the payroll of Pennsylvania's anthracite breakers at once, sorting rock from coal with their hands. That number kept climbing for decades after reformers first started screaming about it. Laws got passed. The number went up anyway. Most of those boys were between 8 and 12 years old. The law technically said 12 was the floor. Getting under it took a forged birth certificate, a cooperative magistrate, and about the price of a week's groceries, and companies rarely asked hard questions about paperwork that let them keep paying a child 5 to 7 cents an hour instead of a grown man's wage. They worked without gloves. Not because nobody thought of gloves, because gloves made it harder to feel the difference between coal and the razor-edge slate mixed in with it. And speed was the only thing that kept a boy his seat. So small hands went in bare, for 10 hours, 6 days a week, and came out every single day cut and bleeding from rock, sharp enough to open skin like a blade. The conveyor belts took fingers outright. The rollers and gears underneath the picking floors took more than that. Feet, hands, whole limbs, boys pulled bodily into machinery that was never built with a child's reach in mind. And here is the detail that should turn your stomach. Supervisors didn't stop the breaker to retrieve a boy caught in its works. They couldn't. The whole building ran as one continuous cascade of falling coal, and shutting it down mid-run meant losing a full batch of product and the money that came with it. So a boy pulled into the gears stayed there, machinery running around him, until the shift itself ended and someone finally went looking for what was left. We'll come back to exactly why that machine could never be stopped for one screaming child. That's coming. Then there was what the building did to the ones who survived it. Every boy who breathed its air for 10 hours a day was pulling coal dust into lungs that hadn't finished growing. Some of them coughed up something black by their teenage years, and for the better part of a century, the men whose job it was to examine those boys, physicians employed and paid by the same coal companies running the breakers, looked at black spit and blackened lungs and told the patient it was nothing. A few of the era's most respected doctors went further than nothing. They argued, in professional journals, that the dust itself was never really the dangerous part to begin with. That lie did not get corrected in a year or a decade. It survived 2 world wars. And the building itself, the physical structure, 11 stories of steel that had swallowed 3 generations of boys, didn't get torn down when it stopped operating. It didn't get torn down for decades after that. It just stood there, empty, rotting, watching the town it had built and broken, until one spring day in 2014 when somebody finally, deliberately, brought it down. That's the debt this whole story is walking toward. Why did that take so long? We're going to pay it off, piece by piece, starting at the beginning, in a decade before there was a single law on the books to break. Born from a company's broken machine, the coal underneath Pennsylvania didn't come out of the ground clean, and that single fact built and then destroyed thousands of lives. Anthracite, hard coal, the kind that burned hotter and cleaner than anything else available to 19th century America, came up out of the mines mixed with slate, rock, and waste, in roughly equal measure to the fuel itself. A shipment full of rock wasn't just worthless. It was a company's reputation, gone, along with the customer who'd paid for it. Somebody had to get the rock out before the coal ever left the valley. And for years, the only method anyone had was a man with a hammer, breaking lumps by hand and hoping he caught the slate before it reached a buyer. In 1844, a Philadelphia engineer named Joseph Batten solved half the problem with iron, 2 heavy rollers, crushing coal down to a manageable size, feeding it through a spinning screen that sorted pieces by how big they were. His invention went up in Schuylkill County that same year, and it worked well enough that within 2 decades it had stopped being an experiment and started being the standard. By 1866, breakers across the region had grown from single rooms into towering multi-story buildings, and the rollers had solved the crushing problem completely. They hadn't solved the other half. Rollers and screens could crush coal and sort it by size. They could not tell rock from fuel. That distinction still needed a human eye and a human hand. Thousands of them, working fast, for cheap, for hours on end. And the coal companies of northeastern Pennsylvania found their labor force in exactly the place you'd expect a 19th century industry to look when it needed workers nobody would fight for. The sons of the men already underground. It was cheaper. It was, by the standards of the time, simply how the business worked. And it turned buildings meant to clean fuel into machines that consumed children instead. Anthracite mattered enough to the country that when the men who mined it walked off the job in 1902, a sitting president got personally involved for the first time in American history. The coal ran city apartment stoves without choking tenants in the black soot that softer bituminous coal produced, which made it the fuel of choice for exactly the kind of dense urban populations that couldn't survive a winter without it. When that strike threatened to leave the Northeast without heat as the cold months approached, Theodore Roosevelt summoned both sides to Washington and forced a resolution, the federal government's first direct intervention in a labor dispute of this kind. That single fact tells you how much the country depended on what came down off the top of a coal breaker, and how little leverage that dependence ever translated into for the boys standing underneath it. It also tells you nothing about who was standing underneath it while it fell. The danger was there from the very first years these buildings ran, long before anyone thought to write a law about it. In November of 1859, At the Tuckerville Colliery in Schuylkill County, a 32-year-old Irish immigrant named John Hinch was feeding coal into the rollers when something went wrong that nobody ever fully explained. He was drawn into the machine head first. The Pottsville Miners Journal reported what happened next in language the paper didn't soften for its readers. Hinch was, in the newspaper's own words, drawn through the rollers, head first, and instantly killed. His skull was crushed into what the account called a shapeless mass. And here is the part that tells you everything about how these machines were built to run. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody heard it happen over the roar of the crushers. The machine itself only stopped because Hinch's body, wedged in the works, finally jammed it. And that jam was the first thing the engineer noticed. He went looking for the malfunction. He found the man. Hinch had no family in the country to claim him. He'd worked at that colliery for 2 years, saved a respectable sum of money by the standards of the time, and had, by every account, done nothing wrong except stand in the wrong place, while feeding a machine that had no way of telling a careless second from a fatal one. That was 1859. There were no safety inspectors then, no minimum age, no law of any kind standing between a rolling mill and the men who fed it. The breaker didn't need decades to start killing. It started in its first years, and it never really stopped. It only got better at hiding the bodies inside a bigger building. By 1880, an estimated 20,000 boys were working breakers across the state. By 1900, that number had only dipped slightly, to roughly 18,000, even as the census that same year found Pennsylvania employing more children under 16 than any state in the country except Alabama. Reformers were already organizing. Newspapers were already publishing photographs. And still the number of boys in the breakers kept climbing toward its historic peak, still 7 years away. If the danger was this obvious this early, what was it going to take to actually stop the machine? Not the boys inside it, the machine itself, the building that never once stood still. Nothing inside a coal breaker was designed to stop, and that single design choice explains almost every death this story is going to tell. Picture the building the way an engineer of the era would have understood it, not as a factory floor, but as a controlled waterfall of rock, 11 stories tall, powered mostly by gravity. Coal cars arrived at the top and dumped their load into a hopper. From there, everything simply fell, down through rollers that crushed the largest lumps, down through chutes angled just steep enough to keep the material moving without help, down through spinning and shaking screens that separated pieces by size, the way a kitchen sieve separates flour from grit. Sorting bars split the falling stream into different channels depending on what size of coal each customer had ordered. And at several points along that fall, the coal passed over what the industry called a slate picker screen, sometimes a mud screen, a stretch where the good, round pieces of anthracite dropped straight through the mesh, while the flatter, sharper pieces of slate rode across the top of it toward a chute of their own. That screen is where the boys sat, not because a person was the best tool available, because a machine, in 1860, couldn't yet see the difference between coal and rock, and a boy's eyes and hands, however small, could. Breakers of this design ranged anywhere from 80 to 150 feet tall, roughly the height of an 8 to 15-story building, and every one of those feet was in motion at once. Steam engines drove the rollers. Belts snapped taut and slack in a rhythm that never quite settled into anything a human ear could get used to. The whole structure vibrated under the weight of tons of falling rock, hour after hour, and the noise inside a working breaker was loud enough that foremen communicated with hand signals as often as shouting. Heat radiated up from the boiler rooms below, even as cold drafts cut through gaps in the siding above. A boy on the picking floor sat in the middle of all of it, deafening, shaking, breathing, for 10 hours at a stretch. Later breakers added more. Water jigs shook coal in a bath, letting the heavier waste sink, while lighter fuel floated free. The most advanced plants eventually installed something called a Menzies cone, a tank of water thickened with magnetite, until its density sat precisely between coal and rock, so that anthracite floated to the top and slate sank straight to the bottom. No human judgment required at all. But that technology arrived slowly, plant by plant, over decades, and until it did, the eyes and fingers of a child were the cheapest sorting mechanism the industry had. The impossibility at the center of all of it was economic as much as mechanical. Large, clean lumps of anthracite sold for a premium over small or broken pieces, so a design that crushed everything down to a uniform size would have been cheaper to build and worse for the balance sheet. The whole plant had to sort coal into a range of specific sizes, preserve the valuable large pieces intact, and strip out the worthless rock, all while moving tonnage fast enough to keep a railroad's worth of coal cars filled every single day. No single machine of the period could do all three at once. That gap between what the rollers and screens could manage and what the company's ledgers demanded is exactly where a boy's hands got inserted. Here is the debt this chapter was built to pay off. Why couldn't the breaker simply stop when a boy went into the gears? Because nothing in that design included a pause. Coal cars kept arriving at the top on a fixed schedule. The whole cascading system, top to bottom, was built around continuous gravity flow. Halt it partway, and you didn't just lose a few minutes. You lost an entire load of coal jammed mid-fall. Hardened waste-clogging screens meant to keep moving. Hours of cleanup, and money the company had no intention of losing over one child. The machine was engineered to run, full stop, and it did exactly what it was built to do, even when a body was caught inside it. Louis Hine understood that better than almost anyone outside the industry. Hired to document conditions for the National Child Labor Committee in the early 1900s, he spent hours inside these buildings with a camera, watching boys work through air thick enough to taste. In his own field notes, describing one Pennsylvania breaker, he wrote that the dust was so dense at times as to obscure the view. That same dust, he noted, didn't stop at the edges of a boy's clothing. It went straight into his lungs and stayed. The engineering that made this building profitable and the engineering that made it lethal were the same engineering. Nobody had to choose cruelty on purpose. They only had to choose speed, and speed alone did the rest. 11, and already old. By the time a boy turned 12 in the anthracite region, half his friends had already quit school for good, and nobody around him treated that as a tragedy. Francis Mack went to work at the breaker at 8 years old, not long after the Great Strike of 1902 had torn the region apart. When the foreman asked his age, Mack said 14. The foreman told him to prove it, so Mack walked to the local magistrate, paid a small fee, and walked out with a signed paper certifying he was exactly the age he needed to be. 3 years later, at 11, he did the same trick again to get work underground, this time claiming 16, the legal minimum for a job inside the mine itself. Nobody who processed that paperwork believed him. Nobody stopped him either. Stanley Guntack started at 12, not because his family forced him, but because every friend he had was already working and telling him he was, in his own words years later, a big boy who should get a job. That was the whole culture of these towns. A boy who stayed in school past 12 wasn't virtuous. He was strange. Then there was Neil Gallagher, of Wilkes-Barre, who started at the Pennsylvania Coal Company's breaker at 11 years old. You are 11 years old, and this is your seat. A wooden bench positioned directly over a moving chute, coal rushing past beneath your boots at a pace set by men who are paid to keep it fast. Your hands are bare because gloves would slow you down, and a foreman is already walking the row behind you with a stick in case your attention drifts. The air tastes like it before it smells like anything, gritty, metallic, coating the inside of your mouth. 10 hours of this stretch out ahead of you, and tomorrow holds another 10, and the day after that another 10 again, 6 days out of every 7, for years. At the end of that 10 hours, the whistle blew, and the row of boys went quiet in a different way than they'd been loud all day. No cane could hurry a walk home. They filed out past the culm banks in the fading light, coats too thin for the season, saying almost nothing to each other, hands stuffed in pockets to keep the cut fingers warm. Some of them stopped at a creek or a trough to wash the worst of the black dust off their faces before they reached their own front doors, not because anyone told them to, but because a mother waiting inside didn't need to see exactly what the day had cost. The building behind them kept running into the evening for the next shift. It never really rested. They did for a few hours, until the whistle called them back before dawn. That was the daily reality underneath the numbers. Boys worked from 7 in the morning, 10 hours a stretch, for 5 to 7 cents an hour, wages that meant a full week's labor bought less than $2, at a time when a working man's daily rate hovered somewhere around $3 a day, when he could get steady work at all. Foremen carried canes, and sometimes worse. Lewis Hine, watching these rows of boys for the camera, described what kept them moving. A kind of slave driver sometimes stood over them, in his words, prodding or kicking them into obedience. The physical toll accumulated in ways that had nothing to do with the machinery. Slate-cut fingers open, day after day, until the skin never fully healed between shifts. Boys developed permanent stoops from 10-hour days spent hunched forward over a chute. Their eyes stung constantly from grit that never settled, and by the time many of them reached their teenage years, they were already coughing. Neil Gallagher's story didn't end with a stoop or a cough. By the time he was 18, his leg had been amputated. Then it happened again, a second amputation, on a body that had already given the company 7 years of labor, starting well before it was legally allowed to. He received no compensation of any kind, not from the coal company that had employed him since childhood, not from any fund, not from anyone. There was, at the time, no framework that required one. Insurance companies of the era wouldn't cover mine or breaker work at all. The job was considered too dangerous to underwrite, which meant an injured boy or man had no safety net beneath him whatsoever. If the company chose not to pay, nothing compelled it to. This is where the old joke of the coal region turned genuinely bitter. Miners used to say it themselves. Once a man, twice a boy. A boy started in the breaker, sorting slate with his hands. He graduated underground as a teenager, into darker and more dangerous work as a door tender, then a mule driver, then eventually a miner in his own right. And when his body finally gave out, when black lung stole his wind, or an injury like Gallagher's took a limb, or simple age caught up with a trade that used men up fast, many of them came back to the breaker one more time. Too broken for the mine, still needing income, they returned to the building where they'd started as children, now working alongside boys young enough to be their grandsons, doing the same picking work with hands that had spent decades in the dark. The building didn't just take from you once, at the beginning. It waited, and it took again at the end. By 1902, government investigators finally started paying attention in a formal way. The commission appointed that year to study the anthracite strike found, in testimony gathered directly from the collieries, that nearly 1% of all breaker boys working the region were under 12 years old, the supposed legal floor, and that thousands more were working under 14 in violation of the spirit, if not always the letter, of the law. Their report became public record in 1903. It changed remarkably little. If a government commission already had the numbers in writing, what was actually standing between that report and a boy's next shift? Not ignorance. Something closer to a decision, made quietly, by people who never had to explain it to anyone. The lie they told with a straight face. Every disaster in this story so far has had a name attached to it, a date, a single body. This one didn't work that way. This one killed for more than a century and mostly stayed invisible, because the men running the industry made sure it did. Physicians had known something was wrong with miners' lungs since at least the early 1800s. They called it miner's asthma, or sometimes miner's consumption. The medical term that eventually stuck was anthracosis. Coal dust lodged permanently in lung tissue, turning healthy pink flesh a deep, uniform black, visible on autopsy tables to anyone who cut a dead miner open. By 1892, the disease was serious enough to earn its own description in Osler's Principles and Practice of Medicine, one of the most respected textbooks in American medicine at the time. The pattern was documented. The cause was documented. The victims were everywhere, coughing black sputum into handkerchiefs across every coal town in the state. And then, right around the turn of the century, the official story changed. Prominent physicians, respected ones, published ones, the kind whose word carried weight in courtrooms and compensation hearings, began arguing that improved conditions in the mines had all but eliminated the problem. By the 1930s, medical attention shifted almost entirely toward silicosis, a related disease caused by rock dust rather than coal dust, and in doing so, quietly let coal dust itself off the hook. Coal, the argument went, wasn't the dangerous part. It was only dangerous if it happened to be mixed with silica, and even that claim came wrapped in enough hedging to make compensation nearly impossible to win. That was the tease from Chapter 1, paid off in full, not a lie about the disease not existing, but a lie about which dust was allowed to be blamed for it. It wasn't a disease they didn't understand. It was a diagnosis they buried. Think about what that meant for a boy like the ones in this story. He started at 8 or 11, breathing dust 10 hours a day out of lungs that hadn't finished forming. He graduated underground as a teenager into denser, worse air. He spent his 20s and 30s breathing coal dust as a full miner. The disease didn't announce itself all at once. It started as an occasional shortness of breath, easy enough to shrug off, then a cough that wouldn't fully clear, then black-tinged sputum in the morning, the sign that lung tissue was breaking down faster than a body could clear it. By the later stages, a man's chest tightened permanently, his lips took on a bluish cast from blood starved of oxygen, and climbing a single flight of stairs could leave him gasping. And if his chest started failing him by 40, if he began coughing black, losing his wind on stairs, waking up unable to breathe, the company doctor sent to examine him had every professional and financial incentive to write down that nothing was wrong. No diagnosis meant no claim. No claim meant no payout, no pension, no acknowledgement that the industry itself had done this to him. The average life expectancy for a coal miner in this era hovered around 32 years. Not retirement age, total lifespan. Explosions killed some of them, cave-ins killed others, but a staggering number simply drowned, slowly, in their own scarred lung tissue, and died of something the record books were permitted to call anything except what it actually was. This is the sacrifice that one observer, addressing the National Child Labor Committee in 1904 after touring these breakers firsthand, tried to put into words that would actually land. He'd watched the boys at work with his own eyes, watched the foreman, watched the dust hang in the air thick enough to chew. And he asked the room the only question that mattered: is this sacrifice of youth necessary for the prosperity of the mining industry? Nobody in a position of power answered him. Not that year, not for decades. The silence held through 2 world wars. It held through the growth of labor unions strong enough to win wage increases and shorter shifts, but not, for a long time, official recognition of the one disease that was killing their members slowest and most certainly. It held until a handful of physicians, starting seriously in the 1950s, began publishing research that refused to accept the industry's line. One of them, a West Virginia doctor writing in 1954, stated flatly what should have been obvious for 100 years. This was a real, progressive, and ultimately terminal disease, caused by exactly what it looked like it was caused by. It took activists, miners themselves, alongside doctors willing to lose favor with an entire industry, another 15 years of organizing before the federal government finally passed the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. The first law that formally recognized the disease, funded its study, and created a path toward compensating the men who had it. By then, it was far too late for most of the boys in this story. Neil Gallagher, twice amputated, never received a cent from the company that employed him starting at age 11. No further record exists of what became of him after that. No pension, no settlement, no follow-up. The paper trail simply ends there, at no compensation, and stays ended. And even after 1969, even after the science was finally officially settled, the disease didn't go away. As recently as the early 2010s, coal dust disease was still killing on the order of 25,000 people a year worldwide. Not a relic of the 19th century, a live, ongoing consequence of a fuel the modern world still burns. The building that started all of it was still standing through every year of that fight. Empty by then, silent, but standing, a monument nobody had gotten around to removing, over a town that had given it 3 generations of lungs and never gotten so much as an apology in return. The day the valley went black one last time. One building outlived every excuse this industry ever made for itself. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in 2014, it simply wasn't allowed to anymore. The structure that finally answers this video's central question wasn't one of the old ones. It went up in 1939, built by the Glen Alden Coal Company in the borough of Ashley, in Luzerne County, to replace an older breaker, the Maxwell, that had been damaged 2 years earlier during a bitter strike. They named the new plant after the company's chairman, Charles Huber, and when it opened, the trade press treated it as a genuine engineering triumph, rather than one more symbol of the industry's older sins. 6 Menzies cones, tanks of magnetite-thickened water precise enough to separate coal from rock by density alone, made it the most technologically advanced anthracite processing plant operating anywhere in the country. Trade papers of the day genuinely called it a modern wonder. For a while, that description wasn't even an exaggeration. It processed coal from several surrounding collieries at once, turning out Glen Alden's signature product. Anthracite dyed a distinctive blue, so customers could recognize the company's coal on site. For close to 2 decades, the Huber breaker ran near the peak of what an anthracite processing plant could be. Then the ground shifted under the entire industry, and no amount of engineering could fix it. After the Second World War, American homes and factories switched over to oil and natural gas in enormous numbers, cleaner-burning fuels that didn't require a building full of machinery or a workforce of broken men to prepare them for market. Anthracite mining across Pennsylvania went into a decline it never recovered from. Collieries that had run for a century closed within a few years of each other. The Huber breaker held on longer than most of its neighbors, but by 1976, even it had run out of coal worth processing, and Glen Alden shut it down for good. Here's what should have happened next, by any normal accounting of how a dead industrial building gets treated. It should have been demolished within a few years, the site cleared, the land repurposed. That's not what happened. The Huber breaker just stood there. For nearly 40 years, weather stripped its paint and rusted its steel. Vandals broke in through windows that had once flooded 11 stories of picking floors with daylight. Scrap thieves picked at what they could carry out. And through all of it, the building refused to fall down on its own, standing over Ashley like something that had simply forgotten how to stop existing. Visible from the interstate for miles, a hulking, rust-streaked silhouette that every local driver had long since stopped consciously noticing, except that it was always there. It became, without anyone planning it, the last of its kind. Nearly every other anthracite breaker built during the boom years had already been torn down, burned, or quietly scrapped by the time anyone thought to ask what the Huber breaker actually meant to the people who'd grown up in its shadow. And when locals were finally asked, in interviews conducted as demolition loomed, the answer wasn't simple pride. One longtime resident, describing what the building represented to people who'd lived their whole lives under it, Put it in 5 blunt words: what it did to us. That tension, heritage on one side and entire communities' inherited trauma on the other, never got resolved. A preservation society formed. Former mine employees, local business owners, and history-minded residents fought for years to save the Huber Breaker as a museum, a physical reminder of what the region had survived. Genuine effort went into it. Money did not follow the effort. At one point, Luzerne County floated the idea of seizing the property through eminent domain, but that plan collapsed into legal disputes and broken promises before it produced anything. By August of 2013, the site went to auction in bankruptcy court and sold for $1.25 million to a Philadelphia scrap company, Paselo Logistics, whose interest in the property had nothing to do with history and everything to do with the roughly 900 tons of steel still locked inside its frame. Demolition on the smaller outbuildings began in the last week of January 2014, and for those first weeks Ashley existed in a strange, held-breath quiet. The building everyone had grown up under was still standing, still visible from the highway exactly as it always had been, but now with a fixed expiration date attached to it. People drove past it slower than usual that winter. A few brought cameras. Nobody organized anything official. There was no funeral planned for a coal breaker. But the town knew, in the specific way small places know things, that something that had simply always been there was about to not be. The main structure, the 11-story breaker itself, the building this entire story has been about, came down on April 24th. An 80-year-old man named Ray had lived in Ashley his whole life. He'd spent years hauling coal out of the very building now scheduled to fall, and on demolition day he had, in his own words, a front-row seat he never asked for. He watched the excavators and the wrecking claw tear into steel that had stood since before most of the town's current residents were born, listened to it groan and shriek before it went. A sound closer to something dying than something merely being dismantled. And when the structure finally gave way, it didn't go quietly. An enormous cloud of black dust, the same coal dust this entire story has followed from a boy's bare hands into his lungs, billowed hundreds of feet into the air and began drifting, unmistakably, toward the part of town where people still lived. One woman filming the collapse on her phone watched the cloud crawl toward her own street and said, without much surprise in her voice, that it looked like it was heading straight for her house. That is the great fall this video's title promised you. Not a metaphor, not a slow, symbolic decline. A specific building on a specific afternoon coming down under specific machinery and sending one final wave of the exact substance that had been killing this town for 137 years rolling back over it, one more time, for old time's sake. The powerhouse and the last of the colliery structures followed in August. And almost immediately, new questions replaced the old ones. Residents and state regulators began asking whether the asbestos known to be present throughout the aging structure had been handled properly during demolition, whether tearing down a poison-filled monument to one public health disaster had simply created a smaller, faster version of the same problem. By 2016, Paselo Logistics was cited by Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection for improperly cleaning the site, a documented violation of the state's Solid Waste Management Act. The building that spent nearly a century filling lungs with one kind of dust went out by kicking up a different kind on its way down, and the argument over whether that had been handled responsibly outlasted the demolition itself by years. What's left today, more than a decade later, is mostly open ground, a scattering of hopes for a museum that hasn't materialized. A community still divided over whether the empty lot represents relief, loss, or both at once. There's a particular kind of bitterness buried in the timing of all this. The fuel this building spent 137 years processing, the fuel that justified every child's ruined hand and every miner's collapsed lung as the unavoidable cost of keeping a nation warm, barely heats anything anymore. Oil, gas, and electricity took over decades before the building itself came down. The sacrifice had already stopped being necessary to anyone, long before the industry admitted the disease it caused was real, and long before the wrecking crews finally showed up. The country simply moved on to easier fuel and left the debt unpaid. Neil Gallagher never got a settlement for the leg the industry took from him, twice, starting when he was a child. John Hinch never got so much as a grave marked with more than a name. 24,000 boys at the historic peak of this practice never got an apology, and the vast majority of them are old men now, if they're anything at all. Their lungs, however they ended up. Nobody who fed this machine, at either end of its 137 years, walked away clean. The building didn't either, in the end. It stood over that valley for a century and a half, took what it wanted from 3 separate generations of the people underneath it. And when its turn finally came, it didn't go easily either. It groaned, it cracked, it threw one last cloud of black dust over the town that had fed it. It just took longer than anyone else to fall.